Welcome to the Hope for Parents of Struggling Teens podcast. My name is Brandon Joffe. My hope with this podcast is that I can touch on relationship and mental health issues in a way that is more helpful than some of the resources out there, and that we can weed out some of the unhelpful trends in the industry of mental health and figure out what really works in fixing our relationships and the stuff that doesn't feel so good going on in our heads. The Inspired Resolution Center is dedicated to helping families with teens, so I'm going to talk a lot about teen mental health, parenting, and of course, the different family relationships that go on in families with teens. In today's episode, we're going to talk about gaslighting, and I've got Brittany Johns again on with me. She is my partner at Inspired Resolutions and really is kind of responsible for everything that goes on there. But I wanted to do this with her instead of alone because gaslighting is, number one, a really trendy concept right now that everybody's talking about. Number two, because a lot of people are getting it wrong, including professionals in the mental health world, to be honest. And I also wanted to talk about this with her because I think it's important to get this concept from two types of people. Number one, I'm a man, she's a woman. Number two, I'm more, can we say, loud and assertive? And, sometimes that can be one of my flaws. And she is a little more introverted, quieter, and has just I'm rougher and she's a lot softer. So we're kind of the yin and the yang. And so I think it's important with this subject to hear from the both of us. What do you think, Brittany?
Yeah, absolutely. And to bring light to this topic, as with teens, I'm sure parents have heard, if they're being very savvy on Googling or just hearing different hot topics of mental health code words. So this has been something that your teens have probably heard a lot. So to give parents some light to it as well. And also it was the Webster's Dictionary word of 2022. So we want to give everyone an actual depiction of where gaslighting came from and how it's present in the arena of mental health and where what it actually is, instead of, just throwing around the idea of I've been gaslighted, where maybe it might be something else. Right. But to give everyone a good idea of what actual gaslighting looks like in some scenarios.
Yeah. And I think that first and foremost, I'm hoping that the people who listen to this podcast will stop throwing that word around. It's a really important word for abuse work that we do, for helping people put words to something that they experienced that previously in the world didn't really have an explanation, right? It was something that a lot of people experienced but couldn't put their finger on. And so I love that we have this very formal definition that everybody is aware of, but like anything that everybody becomes aware of, it can get misused. And so I want to read the definition of gaslighting. And again, I'm going to say this probably 10 more times in this podcast, but the key is that gaslighting is a behavior that is used by people who are abusive in order to make the victim feel crazy and not be able to feel in control. It's a control tactic. And so the definition is, it is a form of psychological manipulation in which the abuser attempts to sow self-doubt and confusion in their victim's mind. Typically, gaslighters are seeking to gain power and control over the other person by distorting reality and forcing them to question their own judgment and intuition. And so there's various ways that people who use this as a tool for control and abuse use it, but that's the key. The key is that it is an abusive tactic used for manipulation and control. Sometimes I think that we do something that I guess could be defined as gaslighting, but it's done a little bit more innocently because you're wrapped up in a debate. Or maybe you feel a little frustrated right there, but the spirit is not behind it. And so I think what's important with a lot of concepts we talk about in mental health, Brittany, is that we both talk about kind of the technical definitions and then we talk about the spirit behind it, because that's, in my opinion, that's fairly important. What do you think?
Oh, definitely, because I think it's important to empower people to be able to know the severity of what gaslighting looks like too. And like you said, even in some of the definitions that I've seen too, it's very insidious the way that it happens. And then it also happens when a person grows to know someone well enough to know how to make that person feel quote unquote crazy in the moments of when they're making them through the kind of the coding of the gaslighting that doesn't happen just overnight.
Yeah. Okay. I really like that you said that, because there's a difference between, I just got caught up in a debate with my friend and I didn't even realize I slipped into kind of manipulation and trying to, there's a difference between that spirit and then the idea of somebody who gets to know somebody, uses their knowledge of that person against them, and then makes them feel completely crazy. They know, for instance, your little triggers for self-esteem. And so then they pounce on that and make you feel crazy in those conversations. So I appreciate you pointing that out. And it's purposefully creating self-doubt and confusion in the victim. In when we're talking about true gaslighting as an abusive tool, there is a victim and there is a perpetrator, right? It's something that I've seen in some of the families and couples that I've worked with. And, a while back, I was talking to a particular person. I actually got in a little bit of a disagreement about gaslighting, and I was baffled. And I proceeded to I was just baffled that we were having this kind of debate. And I tried to defend myself. And I was told that I was gaslighting. So this was not a good conversation in my life. I regret even participating in it, to be honest. But I was told that I was gaslighting, and I stopped the conversation. I said, what am I being dishonest about? And what am I trying to manipulate? I'm trying to have a conversation with you. And in the moment, I remember feeling like the pouncing on gaslighting against me was kind of part of the manipulation, but I don't know. And so their response to me was this, Brittany. They said, well, I don't know what you're trying to manipulate, but I feel gaslit and that is my truth. So you are gaslighting me. And I didn't continue with this particular conversation, but it got me to thinking about this whole concept of my truth, right? I don't know. There's some things that it has nothing to do with what your truth is, right? There's your experience. There's your opinion. There's what you felt while you were experiencing something. But in my mind, there's only one truth. There's not your truth. There's the truth, and then there's what both sides of a conversation or both parties experience. Any thoughts on that, Brittany?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, Brandon, to cap what you were saying is where you're able to stop the conversation and just regroup. That doesn't happen when real gaslighting is taking place. It's almost after the fact when the person's able to kind of recoil and kind of say, like, wait, what was actually happening was actually in the moment of the heat of the gaslighting. Mm-hmm. It happens so quickly that there's not even those moments like where you were saying, hey, where are we at? Like, what is the truth in this? It just feels so discombobulated that there is no truth really in it. It's just where the person's being gaslit. So I think that's a good example of where gaslighting didn't happen, but people are getting caught up in the idea of the gaslighting where it's like, no, I've been gaslit, but it really is this almost like out of body experience where you're like, wait, what happened? And before you can figure it out, it just has occurred.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, and hopefully we can depict some examples, because I think examples is going to be really important. And we'll see if we can hit it on the mark. I was talking to somebody, I know somebody who was being accused of being abusive, and she would use seeds of truth to kind of make him question, and I was working with him, is gone through some periods where he was questioning, oh my gosh, am I abusive? And it's interesting because if somebody's really, really worried about being abusive and wants to make the change, they've probably made some really bad mistakes. They might have been mean, but I don't know that type of person is usually the abuser, right? They might have some really bad moments, but abusers have a history and pattern of abuse that goes on and on and on. And it's basically a part of who they are. If they don't get serious help, they cannot stop those patterns, no matter how, even though they might have moments that they're sorry, right? And that they want to change. The abuser cannot change. It's like an addiction. They can't change without help. And so this particular person, they were really frustrated. They were spending a lot of money on trying to figure out custody issues. And she had convinced a lot of people that, basically that he was controlling and terrible and controlling with money. And it was interesting because he would basically get berated for the money that they had. And then the most that he would ever do was say, hey, we're spending a lot of money right now. Maybe we need to cool it. This was while in the marriage. So I worked with him in the marriage and after the marriage. And then in one of the arguments of this, she berated him and told him that he not only controlled money, but hid finances. And so he was baffled because in his desire to kind of try to fix this relationship, he became really doubtful. And this was kind of in the transition of marriage to divorce. And it was interesting because what happened was they would get in this argument. She would say, basically make him feel guilty for not being able to spend money, let her spend money, then get mad because they spent too much money and say that she wanted him to help with saving money. So then he would say, hey, we're at this number for the month. And then she would go and say, see, you're so controlling. I've talked to all my friends. I can't believe that you would even come at me this way. I'm trying to raise our child. Don't you know that I have to buy groceries? And so the reason this is gaslighting, because it's somebody asking to be held accountable for money. And then when they're lightly told, hey, we're spending too much money this month, they bring up, see, she's on point. She's talking about finances, but it's gaslighting because nobody's saying don't spend the money on the kids, don't buy groceries, don't get gas, don't get the necessities. Nobody was even saying, hey, don't use some money for fun. The comment was just simply, hey, our credit card bill is really high this month. We might want to tone it down. And so that's gaslighting because it gets so confusing because she is responding to money. She's responding to the topic, but not responding to the context and the issue that he's actually trying to bring up. And that's an example of gaslighting, is when you're trying to bring up an issue and then somebody brings up a whole bunch of related things, kind of pelts you with it, and then makes you go, wait, was that what I was saying? Was I saying that you can't buy groceries? Oh my gosh, wait, I don't know. Wait, but I buy the groceries, but I just want you to do this. And then the other person throws a temper tantrum, basically, and no reasonable conversation can be had because then they shut it down and will just pelt with the out of context but on topic issues. How did that example come off to you, Brittany?
Example to like the core idea of what was the conversation was ideally set out to be got misconstrued because when that's happening in a gaslighting situation, the person's kind of using more core, difficult, value of the other person, where then it throws off the whole, then that's where you are unable to kind of see the truth and get back to what the exact kind of topic of the conversation was about. And then it gets into all the other aspects. And that's where the doubting of their memory and perceptions, and even like looking at the sanity in the conversation gets all misconstrued when, like you said, the topic was starting to talk about just how do we get back online with not using the credit card as a gift card kind of thing. And it's like, wait, what happened? And all of that, then it got off track with the gaslighting situation. So
right.
it's a perfect depiction.
And this is a big thing in these days, right? Using a hot topic like being controlling of money is something that happens a lot. A lot of, people will use money to control their spouses. And so there's a big difference between holding somebody accountable for being responsible with money in a marriage and somebody giving you an unreasonable allowance and giving you, an impossible task of you don't have enough money, but you better meet these expectations, right? You better go get the groceries I want, but I'm only going to give you $5 would be something that from an abuser who controls money. Saying, hey, we're spending a lot this month. Can we slow it down? Is not controlling. And it was really interesting because in this example with this case, the husband had given the wife all of the account information and passwords and everything. And at one point, she accused him of being controlling and abusive with money because he controlled all the finances and would berate him and say, you don't let me in on the money. You must be hiding things at work. You are. And that's a big deal. That happens in a lot of abusive situations where the abuser will hide work, hide money, will be controlling in that way. But in this case, what was going on is the wife just did not want to take responsibility for checking accounts and being a part of managing money. And so that's another example of gaslighting. Hey, you're abusing me because you don't let me have access. And I'm pretty sure you're hiding things because, I don't know what goes on at your business and I don't know what you're doing. That's not the same as somebody who's actually being abusive with money. And so I remember this woman would say things like, oh, see, I don't buy any clothes for myself, right? And the husband would say, yeah, but I want you to. I even give you gift cards for you to buy as many clothes as you want for your birthday, for Christmas. I want you to have all the clothes that you want. And so it was interesting in this situation because she would become a victim and say, see, you don't let me buy clothes. You don't let me buy groceries. And that wasn't the case. And again, this particular gentleman would spin out wondering, oh my gosh, am I terrible? What am I going to do? How do I take care of this person? When in fact, for instance, this particular mother would buy thousands of dollars worth of clothes that their child didn't need, which leads into another form of gaslighting. When the husband would confront that, it would be, can you guess what she would say, Brittany?
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
absolutely.
You don't care about your child. Well, are you going to stop me from taking care of our child?
Right. Where the heart of the conversation started somewhere completely different, and it was derailed on a more kind of value of undermining, where the whole purpose went about of going over to I can't take care of my kids. I don't know what's going on in your finances. That's the whole purpose of gaslighting on the other person's part, is to regain power in the conversation or heated argument.
Yeah. Yeah. Another example of gaslighting that I've heard and dealt with a few times is between couples about the house being dirty. The husband yelled at the wife and said, I work my butt off every day and come home to a you-know-what house that's so messy. And the wife argued that she works hard to make sure that the house is picked up and that the kids make sure that their stuff's not around when he comes home. And then the husband looks at the sink and says, there's a bunch of SHI, in the sink, and there's crap all over the place, and points out all the messes in the house and tells her, you're a horrible wife. You're a horrible mother. You don't care about us. You don't care about the kids. You can't even clean anything up. And then it turns out the messes were all his. And when she tried to point that out, he switched gears and told her that she never makes him feel wanted or appreciated when he comes home. He also yelled at her and told her that she nitpicks and expects him to have everything picked up right away, even though he's exhausted, and he was going to eventually take care of it. And so that's so manipulative and so abusive, right? The husband comes home and says, look at this, look at this mess, and the messes are his. And then when that's pointed out, he becomes the victim. Like, oh my gosh, why are you attacking me and nitpicking me? When he was doing that very thing, even though it wasn't her stuff, and she had tried to have the house perfectly cleaned for him. And in the case that I'm thinking of, it's kind of like this guy could come home and make a mess in, 5 seconds flat, and then would get angry and frustrated with the entire family over it. Have you ever dealt with anything like that in some of your cases, Brittany?
To answer your question about where we see it in the practice of therapy, I think definitely in couples work, but also in parent-child kind of relationships too, where vice versa with parent or child. But also another point that we wanted to touch on today is the difference between what gaslighting looks like and what manipulation looks like, because manipulation happens a lot, as we can imagine, and it's more in an innocent way than as opposed to gaslighting has the overall feel and principles of abusive behaviors with the intent not to just influence someone, but to control them. Mm-hmm. So that's the difference that we wanted to point out too, of what manipulation looks like, just opposed to like throwing out, I've been gaslit, where you might be in a manipulation situation. It's way easier to kind of dissect and get back online with the person that you love.
Yeah.
But if you're in a true gaslighting situation, you feel that abusive spirit and the influence over someone for control.
Right. Sure. And yeah, you bring up a good point. It's so easy to give examples with couples, with parent-child. The teens that we work with get really discombobulated, almost just become defiant because they have no other way to protect themselves. And I think that the parent who's abusive, mentally abusive, is often using this tactic to justify other bad behavior towards their children, right? And make it their children's fault. I mean, sometimes we get parents who want us to fix their child, and there's actually emotional abuse going on. And so educating the child kind of how to protect themselves from it to an extent, even though they don't have very much control, is important. And I think educating the parents who are doing it sometimes can be the seed that's sown, especially if they've experienced it before, can be sometimes the seed that helps break the cycle. And so as therapists, I think we really need to be talking about it in a correct way, not in an all-inclusive way. Right? We've got to keep this term as being as serious as it really is, especially when we're doing parent-child work. The ultimate gaslighting is when the abuser accuses the victim of being the gaslighter, and that's only going on because everybody knows this term now. And so having said that, we don't have too much more time. So I wanted to at least give a little bit of hope. I wanted to tell people how they can kind of help themselves, because it's kind of one of those things when you're experiencing it. There's not that much that you can do. One of the things that I've heard other therapists tell clients that I don't agree with is to encourage the victims to take videos and collect evidence. I actually don't agree with that. I don't think this is healthy. And deep down, the victim knows that they're being honest when they process, especially if they process with a therapist. They can come to their own conclusion on what the truth is and what the lies are with a little bit of work. And I think that process is important. And the thing is that all the evidence in the world is not going to convince the abuser that they're gaslighting. So who are you going to use this evidence for? If you're using it to convince yourself, I want you to rely on yourself and what you know is true. Not what you feel is true, but what you know to be true. And if you need help doing that, I hope you're working with a therapist. But how to help yourself? Number one, you have to stop having the insane conversations and set boundaries with the discussions you're willing to have with the person in your life that does this. Okay. Really, the only complete way to protect yourself is to not engage in the conversations and to almost kind of shut down, to disengage. So you don't want to shut down like you're ignoring, because that might become unsafe, but you disengage. You almost you find the language that can get you out of the conversation. Okay. And then now I said don't collect evidence, but I do think it's important, kind of in a journal-y type way, to keep track of the patterns and write down the truth when you think of it, just so that you can remember and look back on things. And again, it's so that you don't get confused, because gaslighting creates confusion. And so sometimes you want to write down actual simple truths, not your truth, but the simple truths that you can refer back to right after the conversations have happened, so that you're not confused anymore. Okay. And number 3, you cannot get caught up in trying to convince them or anybody else. That trying to convince people and trying to have the debates becomes crazy making in and of itself. Some people will never know the truth. And you working on letting go and grieving the fact that your gaslighter might have got one over on you and convinced somebody else that you're bad, right? I'm not saying don't stand up for yourself, but if you stand up for yourself and it becomes an insane conversation, just grieve that you've lost that, move on, and find things that you actually do control, and work on more productive ways to increase your mental health. And then the last is always ask for help, and, find somebody who's safe for you to process these discussions with and these incidences with. Don't try to do it alone. Okay. Find somebody who will help you be accountable for remembering the truth, for taking control by setting healthy boundaries, and find somebody who's going to be not somebody who's going to berate you or get mad at you because you're not where you need to be yet, but somebody who's going to be really kind and patient with you to process with. Do you have anything to add to that, Brittany?
No, I think those are all the major topics we brainstormed. And on top of that, too, when Brandon's talking about, because I know a lot of clients will say like, okay, yeah, I write this down. Like, what do I actually do? I wanted to kind of touch on too, like what that actually looks like when you're writing down is like this, you would write down like the situation, exactly like where you were, time and event, and then the emotion that you were feeling, the automatic thought that you came up with, what your partner or, what the situation was, kid or, whoever's in the situation of gaslighting, what they said, and then possibly stopping and rewriting the truer version on your end of what that is, and then the follow through of what you're in control over. And then also always remembering, like Brandon and I always say, of who do you want to be and how do I want to act? And then going to a therapist to debrief all of these situations. Yes. But that's how I just wanted to break down like how the actual journaling would look like. It's just an example so that you can collect your thoughts, because when you're in a true gaslighting situation, it's hard to even conceptualize what is the truth. What am I going on? Like you'll feel insane. So that was just my feedback on what an actual like journal entry would look like per se. So that was just my
perfect. I appreciate that. And I think that's important. No, not just, I'm glad that you gave our listeners direction on what exactly to write down. And for those of you who are listening and have experienced this, please rewind back to the steps she gave you for journaling, because I think that process of journaling in that form is going to be really, really helpful. So I appreciate you joining me on this one, Brittany, and I hope that you listeners understand this concept and can maybe be on the same page with me and Brittany, where we think that talking about these types of concepts, it's important to talk about them in the way that they were intended, with the reason that they were defined. Because when we make these concepts just all-inclusive and mean whatever our specific personal truth is or something like that, what happens is the treatment and the growth and the healing becomes less effective. And so anybody who's experiencing abuse, mental, physical, sexual, I hope that today's podcast maybe planted a couple of seeds that give you a little bit more healing. So thank you for listening.